Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. I'm the Magi, and today we're going to be talking about the top 3 draft archetypes for value drafters. And this is kind of my seasonal love letter for everybody out there trying to strike the right balance between value, fun, and being competitive, for those that are trying to get every bit they can out of their draft experience. But hey, before we get into all that, I wanted to take just a moment to thank my community for helping the Stronghold reach a bit of a long-term goal here. 1,000 subscribers on the YouTube channel. Definitely a tremendous thing. Thank you for all the views, all the subs, all the likes, all the comments, and just generally being a very supportive community. It means so much more than you'll ever know. And hey, what do you do when you reach a goal? You set a new one. So moving forward, my main talking point goal is going to be to reach just 50 followers over on Twitch. And frankly, we're already about halfway there, so this one should be really, really easy. If you're not already following me on Twitch, please consider doing so. And that always gives you kind of a sneak peek of some of the live play content, things like that. And of course, the support continues to help the community grow. And I'll be thinking up a giveaway to do once we get there. Probably not a whole account this time around, but hey, that's okay. Now, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, right. Now, before we start talking about archetypes and the specific archetypes of this set, I wanted to take a moment and talk about the legendary uncommon signposts that are prevalent throughout this. In fact, every single archetype has these. And because they are legendary creatures, it is not necessarily a priority to get 4 copies of each of these. And in fact, I think for almost all the archetypes, 2 or 3 copies is going to be the right number for even meta versions of the deck for those that have the signpost in them at all. I would try and get at least one of each of these for brawl purposes and historic brawl purposes, but really with the number of packs that you open, getting 1 copy on these is not going to be terribly difficult. So definitely keep that in mind when you're making your draft picks. You don't necessarily need or even want 4 of these. The one exception might be the Dimir Fairies deck. Before we get into the details of this particular set, it's important to understand the evaluation process that goes into these archetypes. Because we, particularly as budget players, need to make sure that we're maximizing all of that marginal utility to get the very most out of our bang for our buck, so to speak. Way more important than it is for players that are not as budget minded. So there are 3 main factors that I use to evaluate a limited archetype, and they're not presented here in any particular order. And in fact, depending upon your limited environment, these will shift in relative importance. But first, I'd like to talk about value, and that is a concept that we deal with a lot as free-to-play and budget players. Here, we are specifically talking about the ability of a limited archetype to convert itself into a constructed deck, because otherwise we've drafted a bunch of cards that we might never really play again. Next up, let's talk about the accessibility of a particular archetype. And within that, there's a couple of factors here, as you can see. The first consideration is the depth of the archetype. Is this supported by a wealth, a broad depth of low rarity commons and uncommons that really make that archetype work? Or is it very dependent on just very select higher rarity cards, making it a little harder to pull off? Very often within a limited format, we start hearing about the very best deck or the very worst deck, and that affects the way people draft. So one of the issues that we need to be considering is the relative popularity of a deck. Is this going to be highly disputed within your draft pod where 3 or maybe even 4 players are trying to move towards that? and making the cards that much harder to get? Or is this an archetype that people maybe aren't really giving enough justice to, or possibly even actively avoiding, making it wide open for that one player at the table to really take advantage of? And lastly is the issue of flexibility of the archetype. If things don't go to plan, and we all know sometimes that happens more often than we'd like to admit, how easily can we flex or pivot into another archetype or style? How well do those color choices interact with other combinations so that we can make those clutch shifts when we need to? The missing component here, of course, is performance. How well a particular archetype will do within the limited environment against the other cards in that pool and the other competing archetypes. Or to put it in simpler terms, will it win? While value oftentimes takes the front seat for us as a budget community, and winning is less important, the reality is there is a component here for winning. If you are doing any sort of value draft or a token supported premium draft, really just one win makes drafting a better option than just buying packs. If you're outside of that value draft or token supported premium draft, really, again, you're looking at two, maybe more like 2.5, depending upon where you are in the history of Arena, to make that endeavor more worthwhile than buying packs. So winning is an important component here and needs to be taken into account. In the end, all of these different factors and components come together, and I tend to sort the archetypes into three basic tiers. Of course, the top tier is the title of the video, top 3 archetypes. These are the ones that I feel like our budget community needs to be focused on for the various reasons that we have just covered. It is not necessarily the top 3 best performing archetypes overall. As we have explained, there are other factors that budget players need to be mindful of. On the other end of the spectrum, of course, we have the tier 3, the decks that I recommend that you pretty actively avoid because the majority of the time it's just not going to be very beneficial for you. That having been said, of course, on any given day, any given limited event, the colors might come together for you. You might get access to really bomb-tastic cards, and anything could be playable on any given day. The middle ground is what I lovingly refer to as the backup plans, things that are not necessarily one extreme or the other, but often make good fallback points when your tier 1 plans don't come together. Maybe a color dries up, maybe you open a bomb in pack 2 and you need to shift a little bit. Those backup plans can be exactly what saves a draft for you, as opposed to being all in on the top tier aspects. Sometimes it's better to shift into a backup plan and have an overall better performance. All right, so let's start the conversation off as we always do with the decks that I have rated as ugly, meaning there's very little redemption value for these. In no particular order, blue-green is sort of a ramp deck that unfortunately is just not proving itself in the limited environment. It does not synergize at all with the blue-green starter deck and really is not strong enough in its own right to create a new deck here. In fact, it's probably going to be at least another season and perhaps 2 before blue-green really gets to be a strong archetype. If we do see meta decks on this, it is probably going to be built around very specific rare cards like the Goose Mother, and maybe not all that approachable as a budget deck. Next up, we've got the Azorius blue-white tapping things matters. which, as it sounds, is a pretty narrow, limited archetype. In fact, I think the most successful versions of a blue-white deck are more or less going to ignore this and just play good blue-white cards in total. So all in all, this strategy is going to be very difficult to put together. It does not synergize whatsoever with the starter deck, as I don't think there's any real soldiers cards of notes here. And, well, this deck is just not doing enough to unseat blue-white soldiers as our deck of choice. And not necessarily last, the white-black Enchantments Matter deck. Sadly, enchantments just quite don't matter enough. And it doesn't overlap with the existing standard environment to really create a deck archetype of its own, particularly not for budget players. It would take a very strong rare or mythic to pull me into any of these colors, and I strongly suggest just giving these a little bit of room. Black may be the strongest color, but green is probably the weakest, so there you go. Now, before we flip the script and start talking about those top 3 archetypes that I'm recommending, I wanted to take a moment and let everybody know about something new that we're doing this season. I have actually created a spreadsheet showing all of the bonus sheet cards, the enchanting tales, if you would, available in Wilds of Eldraine. This spreadsheet is going to have all of the cards' metrics, my personal notes on it, my personal limited ratings, and overall suggestions for pick orders. And this is going to be available to all levels of my Patreon, including the only $1 a month. And I dare say that this information alone is worth that $1. So if you haven't checked it out, give it a bit of consideration if you would. All right, so at number 3, our girl Greta is bringing us a black-green Dimir Food Matters deck. And, well, this thing has all the potential to be an absolute powerhouse. There are a ton of really solid playable uncommons here that create a lot of synergy, and that's just the sort of thing that we look for in a good budget deck. Knight of the Sweet's Revenge gives you an overrun and ramp ability. Witch's Vanity creates removal, food tokens, and a Wicked Roll token to boot. Welcome to Sweet Tooth creates tokens, food, and another Pump Your Creatures ability. And Tough Cookie is looking to be a really solid 2-drop, both in artifact decks and this food deck. I think that's a card that is going to see a lot of play in a lot of different ways. Ironically, Greta may not even be a cornerstone part of this deck. And in fact, I have to say the other Signpost uncommon, the Gingerbread Hunter, actually looks to be a stronger card overall than Greta. And, well, Greta may not find a place in the deck, but it's early in the season and all that remains to be seen. Oh, and I nearly forgot, this deck is supported by no less than 3 jump-in packs, so it is incredibly accessible for us budget players. Next up at number 2, I'd like to play you a little song I like to call the Pied Piper. No, I'm not actually going to play you a song, don't worry. But rats are going to be a very important part of the season. I think it is, well, ironically, the second best tribe in the set, but the one that has the most potential across multiple formats. Rats are really, really strong. This deck synergizes with the existing red-black starter as a sacrifice-style deck. There's a case to be made for the Rakdos red-black version, as well as maybe mono-red and mono-black versions of the deck. And well, Rat Tribal has some strong archetypes already existing in Eternal formats, as well as Historic Brawl. If I was going to pick one as a new player and really try and get the most out of a very limited card pool, this is exactly where I'd want to be. Not only does the Piper play well with our existing Rakdos starter deck, but it brings even more to the table as it is supported by a jump-in pack as well as some of the singles from the other packs. And at number 1, we've got Blue-Black Fairies. Although this particular archetype is not going to directly mesh well with the existing Dimir starter deck, it is pretty strongly supported by some singles in there, and this archetype is strong enough to stand on its own as a brand new budget deck archetype. It's also supported by a jump-in pack directly and is probably the deepest tribe in the entire set, having really awesome commons and uncommons at its disposal. Of course, Fairies is an existing Eternal archetype and will only get better in those Eternal formats. And of course, it's a very strong limited pick in its own. You can expect this to be highly disputed, and you won't always be able to pick this up, but when you can, it's going to be a very strong investment. If you notice, the one thing that all 3 of our top archetypes have in common, it's that they are all centered around black. And really, it's a good bet to try and take black early in this once you've used your initial picks for rares and mythics, then start going into good black cards. In addition to the specific cards that we've already talked about, Taken by Nightmares is a really strong uncommon removal and a scry ability. This is adding about 1.5% to win rates and is a very strong pick. Also, the commons for black, all but one have positive impact on early win rates, and some of these are just absolutely super strong. Taking black early is almost certainly going to lead you someplace you want to be, whether it's one of these 3 archetypes or a non-black archetype, and just value for your collection. And this, of course, leaves us with our 4 kind of fallback position decks, if you would. The red-white Boros deck is kind of a go wide and go tall strategy, which is a little bit unique. And unfortunately, I don't think it's quite strong enough to really be that Boros-style deck that we're looking to add to our budget deck collection, but it really wouldn't take very much to prove me wrong on that. It's certainly going to be the fastest deck in the format and may have more impact on the limited environment than I'm expecting. The Sorcerer's Apprentice does so much working with the existing Is It Spells deck that we were given in our starter collection. I'm not quite sure that it does enough to make that deck up into tier 1, but again, this is one of those areas that it would not take much to break that out, and picking up a few cards here is definitely going to add to the viability of that deck in the long run. The Gruul Big Beats deck is led by our girl Little Red herself. This is another one of those legendary creatures where 3 or dare I say even 4 copies might be the right number. This individual card is just so good. Overall though, the set and the archetype for limited is trying to ramp, and I just don't think does enough to really give itself a solid place, although there are going to be individual cards here like the Daring Tracker that find their way into meta decks. This is one of those basic archetypes that is represented pretty well in a tier 2 starter deck. And last up, we've got the green-white Enchantments Matter. Again, this is one of those cases I'm not sure enchantments matter enough. This particular archetype or version of enchantments matter. Doesn't really mesh well with the existing enchantments deck for standard. And really, green-white is a very crowded place right now. You have this new archetype. As I said, you had the existing enchantment. You had the starter deck with the +1/+1 counters matters. And you also had a very solid blue-white toxic deck. So really, this color combination needs to be doing more than this in order to be on our radar. And one last broad archetype style thought here is the gold cards in this set are very consistently punching above their weight class. In fact, almost every single one has a positive impact on your win rate, and some of them have really significant positive impacts. Those aren't necessarily the easiest archetypes to build, but when you're able to pull them off, it's not going to be unusual to get 3-4 percentage points out of some of these cards. They are really quite strong. Some of the off-color adventures are even worth playing for either the creature or the adventure side, even if your particular deck is unlikely to cast the other. These also make really strong splash cards for an off-color choice. And my final thought here on this draft environment, don't forget, October is the month that we are probably still going to want to draft Wilds of Eldraine. So whatever budget pathway you selected or fits for you this season, don't forget that you're going to want about 5,000 gold to do at least one quick draft that month. We also have Brothers War featured for the 1st through the 9th, and we don't yet know what that final week or so of October is going to be, but I'd say it's very strongly going to be either Dominaria United or Phyrexia All Will Be One. In any case, WoE is probably your preferred draft environment, at least if you're following the plan, so budget accordingly. And before we go, I want to take just a moment to thank all of my patrons and remind the community when we hit just 10 patrons at any level, we will be rolling out Discord for the entire community, not just paid patrons. So if you have the means or mind to do so, consider supporting our community as it continues to grow. And of course, supporting the community by liking, commenting, subscribing, or sharing our videos is always appreciated.